Hello world, I am Pehel Verma and today we are going to read chapter 2, The End of Bipolarity. Now what does bipolarity means? As we have studied earlier in the first chapter, there was a Cold War situation between two superpowers of the world. After the Second World War, that is after 1945, the US and the USSR. Here in this chapter we are going to learn how did the Cold War ended, because the title says the end of bipolarity, that means end of Cold War. So the first topic which we are going to read is the Berlin Wall issue, which was toppled by the people in 1989. It was an event which started the disintegration of the USSR. Here is how. The Berlin Wall symbolized the division between the capitalist and the communist wall, built in 1961 to separate East Berlin from West Berlin. This more than 150-kilometer long wall stood for 28 years and was finally broken by the people on 9th November 1989. This marked the unification of Germany and beginning of the end of the communist bloc. The pictures here depict people making a tiny hole in the wall. As you can see here, people are making a tiny hole in the Berlin Wall. Next up you can see a section of the wall was open to allow free movement. Here this section of the wall was open to allow free movement between the two parts of Germany. The Berlin Wall as stood before 1989. Here is the third picture which depicts the Berlin Wall as it was before 1989. Next up we are going to learn about the historic chain of events that led to the collapse of the Second World and the end of the Cold War. The next topic, which is the Soviet Union itself disintegrated. We are going to learn about the meaning of the Soviet Union, the causes and the consequences of the disintegration of the Second World, that is the Soviet Union. And lastly, how India relates to these countries now. What are the relations of India with these countries now? So the first segment here is the meaning of the Soviet Union. Here in this paragraph we are going to learn about the meaning of the Soviet Union. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, it is the full form of USSR or Soviet Union, whatever you call it. It came into being after the Socialist Revolution in Russia in 1917. The revolution was inspired by the ideals of socialism, which was opposed to capitalism. The Soviet system, gave primacy to the state and the party, that was the Communist Party. The Soviet political system centered around the Communist Party. No other political party or opposition was allowed. That means there was a one-party system in the Soviet Union. After the Second World War, the East European countries came under the control of the USSR. Now here are the features of the Soviet system. What were the features of the economy, the political system and the administrative system? We are going to read about them. So the first feature was that East European countries came under the control of the USSR. Second feature was that the Second World, or that these countries of the European countries which are under the Second World, under the Second World, were called the Socialist Bloc. The Warsaw Pact, a military alliance, held them together. The Soviet Union became a great power after the Second World War because of its energy resources, a complex communication network, energy resources like oil, iron and steel, and machinery production. Next feature was its domestic industry that produced everything from pins to cars. They ensured a minimum standard of living for all citizens. They even subsidized basic necessities like health, education and childcare. There was no unemployment in the Soviet society. State ownership was dominant form of ownership of land and productive assets. Next up are the drawbacks of the Soviet Union. Here in this segment, we are going to read about some drawbacks of the Soviet system. The drawbacks were that the Soviet system became very bureaucratic and authoritarian. Second, the lack of democracy and absence of freedom of speech stifled people who often expressed their dissent in cartoons and jokes. So the people there did not have freedom of speech. They could not go against the party or the Soviet system. Next up were the institutions of the Soviet state needed reforms. The one party system was unaccountable to the people. Next drawback was that Russia on the papers was only one of the 15 republics of that constituted of the USSR. But in reality, Russia dominated everything and people from other countries felt neglected. The next drawback was that because of the arms race between Soviet Union and US, the Soviet Union lagged behind the West in technology, infrastructure, transport, and more importantly in fulfilling the political or economic aspirations of citizens. We are going to read about this in detail further. Next up, though wages continued to grow, productivity and technology fell considerably behind that of the West. Food imports increased everywhere and the Soviet economy was flattering in the 1970s and became stagnant. These were some of the drawbacks of the Soviet system. Next, we are going to learn about how did the disintegration of USSR happened. Now here it is mentioned in the drawbacks that the institutions of the Soviet state needed reforms. Now this realization was made by one person, that was Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Soviet Union in 1985. He led out the reforms of the Soviet Union. These reforms were necessary to keep the USSR abreast. Now what abreast means here is, we are going to look at it in the dictionary. Abreast means that alongside or level with something. That means the Soviet Union needed to be abreast with the West, that is the US. Next up, the reforms were also needed to normalize relations with the West. Now, what Gorbachev did was, he normalized relations with the West and democratized and reformed the Soviet Union. Now, these reforms had several effects. These effects were that the East European countries started to protest against their own governments and Soviet control. The Soviet Union under Gorbachev did not intervene under the disturbances occurred, and the communist regimes collapsed one after another. This was a major drawback of the Soviet system under Mikhail Gorbachev. Next up was, Gorbachev initiated the policies of economic and political reform and democratization within the country. What this led to? The reforms were opposed by leaders within the Communist Party. A coup took place in 1991 that was encouraged by Communist Party hardliners. Now what a coup is? A coup is a sudden and violent and illegal seizure of power from the government. So the Communist Party government led a coup in 1991. And then gradually power began to shift from the Soviet center to the republics. Now what were another effects? Major republics of the USSR like Russia, Ukraine and Belarus declared that the Soviet Union was disbanded. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union was banned. They declared these things. And then finally, the disintegration of the USSR was a very big surprise to the other republics, especially to the Central Asian ones. Russia was now accepted as the successor of the Soviet Union. Now, what happened after the disintegration? Russia was accepted as the successor state of the Soviet Union. It inherited the Soviet seat in the UN Security Council. Russia accepted all the international treaties and commitments of the Soviet Union. It carried out some nuclear disarmament measures with the US. Now, old Soviet Union was thus dead and buried. Next up, we are going to see why did the Soviet Union disintegrated. Here are the reasons why Soviet Union disintegrated. So the first reason was internal weakness of Soviet political and economic institutions, which failed to meet the people's aspirations. This was the first reason, which included economic stagnation for many years. Now, why did the economy become stagnant? Because Soviet Union went into a race for maintaining a nuclear and military arsenal and development of its satellite states, and which led to a huge economic burden on the system, and it could not cope with it. At the same time, ordinary citizens became more knowledgeable about the advancement of the West, and they were shocked by this psychological and political shock that their Soviet system was far behind the Western system. The next reason for the disintegration was stagnant in an administrative and political sense too. The Communist Party ruled for over 70 years and it was unaccountable to the people. Next reason was Gorbachev's reforms. Gorbachev carried out his reforms and loosened the system. He set in motion forces and expectations that few could predict it and became virtually impossible to control. Gorbachev should have moved much faster. Some people thought that Gorbachev should have moved much faster. Some people thought Gorbachev was moving too quickly, and some people had different opinions. So, Gorbachev lost support on all sides and divided public opinion. This was another reason. Now, the ultimate cause of the disintegration was the rise of nationalism and the desire for freedom and sovereignty between various republics like Russia and the Baltic republics, Ukraine and Georgia. This was the most immediate cause for the disintegration of the USSR. Moreover, Gorbachev's reforms speeded up and increased nationalist dissatisfaction. Next up are the consequences of the disintegration. Now, what happened after the disintegration in the world order? Firstly, it meant the end of the Cold War confrontations. The Cold War was between two superpowers, that is US and the Soviet Union. Now, as the another superpower had disintegrated, there was only one superpower, that was the US. Next consequence was power relations in world politics changed. Here is the detailed answer that the end of the Cold War left open two possibilities. Either the remaining superpower would dominate and create a unipolar system, or different countries or groups of countries would become important players in the international system. So the later happened in the world order, and we will read about it in detail in the next chapter. So the third consequence was that the end of the Soviet bloc meant the emergence of many new countries. As the Soviet Union included many more countries such as the republics, Russia, Baltic republics, Georgia and Ukraine. Now there were many new countries in the UN and in the emergence of new countries. Next up, we are going to read about the shock therapy. Shock therapy is very important regarding your class 12th point of view. And what was the shock therapy? The shock therapy was a painful process of transition from an authoritarian socialist system to a democratic capitalist system. This was called the shock therapy. Now, what the shock therapy included? The shock therapy included total shift to a capitalist economy. Now, all these independent countries from the Soviet bloc had to convert their system from a socialist system to a capitalist system. Now, private ownership was to be the dominant pattern and the ownership of property. Another thing was privatization of state assets and corporate ownership. Private farming was to be introduced. Development was now envisaged through more trade. Free trade was to be considered essential, and openness to foreign investment was very important. The Western capitalist states now became the leaders as they guided and controlled the developments of regions through agencies and organizations like the World Bank and the IMF. Now, what were the consequences of the shock therapy? It brought ruin to the economies and disaster upon the people of the entire region. The industrial complex also collapsed, as 90% of its industries were put up for sale to private individuals and companies. It was called the largest garage sale in history. Next consequence was the value of the ruble, the Russian currency, declined dramatically. The real GDP of Russia went up very low. The withdrawal of the government subsidies pushed large sections of the people into poverty. Another consequence was that the constitution of democratic institutions was not given the same attention and priority as the demands of economic transformation. The presidents had great powers and several of them became authoritarian. For example, the presidents of Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan appointed themselves to power for 10 years and then extended it for another 10 years. Now, there were many tensions and conflicts in the world order. These are mentioned here. We'll skip this because you can read them by your own, and these are very easy to understand. Next up, and the last topic, is India and the post-communist countries. Now, here in this segment, we are going to see the relations between Russia and India only. So, the first point of relations between Russia and India was Indian heroes from Raj Kapoor to Amitabh Bachchan are household names in Russia. The next point was Russia and India share a vision of a multipolar world order. That means they have similar ideas and aspirations. Greater regionalism, negotiated settlements of international conflicts, and independent foreign policy for all countries. Decision making through bodies like the UN should be strengthened, democratized, and empowered. Russia and India agreed on these 4 or 5 agreements. More than 80 bilateral agreements have been signed between India and Russia as part of the Indo-Russian Strategic Agreement of 2001. This is another point of the relations between India and Russia. The fifth point is India stands to benefit from its relationship with Russia on issues like Kashmir, for energy supplies, sharing information on international terrorism, and access to Central Asia, and balancing its relations with China. The sixth point is Russia stands to benefit from this relationship because India is the second largest arms market for Russia. The Indian military gets most of its hardware from Russia. Russia is also important to India as it is an oil importing nation. Now, Russia is important for India's nuclear energy plans and assisted India's space industry by giving, for example, the cryogenic rocket when India needed it. So, Russia supplies its arms to India. Here is another point. The Indian military gets most of its hardware from Russia. This is a very important question regarding MCQ based questions. The Russia and India have